Hi, this is Brock Dickinson, and today I want to talk about the notion of a certain type of meeting that's often held at the United Nations. This is what's known as a COP, or the Conference of the Parties. Now, typically, the UN sort of negotiates a whole series of treaties or agreements or protocols between different countries, and the countries that sign those agreements, those conventions, become known as the parties to that agreement or convention. And so periodically, the UN gathers those countries together to discuss what progress they might have made in implementing the things they promised to do under the terms of that treaty. And so COPs are regular occurrences at the UN on all kinds of different issues. The most famous COP, though, is probably the one that we see in the news all the time related to climate change. There's an annual COP linked to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. And this takes place every year in cities and locations all around the world to sort of assess what progress may have been made on climate change related issues. This year, the COP is going to be taking place in Brazil in November, and preparations for that COP are already underway. There are governments and agencies and organizations and NGOs and businesses that are working on this as we speak. And so in order to get a sense of what they're preparing for, I want to take us back to some footage that I filmed at COP28 in Dubai to explore the different elements and components of a COP and how those pieces fit together.
These COPs kind of function the same way, and one of the most visible elements of a COP is the government component, the part that relates to the United Nations convening governments from around the world. And that takes place in what's known this year as the Blue Zone, which the entrance is located there behind me. I'm not going into the Blue Zone today. It's chaos trying to get in there, often 2 hours sort of working your way through security, etc. But part of what happens in the Blue Zone is that governments from around the world gather to discuss key environmental issues. And often we hear the environmental community complaining that nothing gets done in these sessions. Well, in part, that's true, because that's not how international negotiations work. That here governments are coming together to kind of share positions and statements and ideas, but they're not always kind of fully formulated. They haven't sort of agreed on what they want to do yet. And so sometimes we get disappointed by the results that come out of these processes, but the reality is that behind the scenes, behind those official statements and activities, there's a whole series of one-on-one negotiations, of nation-to-nation discussions, and a set of special sort of relationships being built amongst diplomats and players from around the world that are saying, how can we advance these discussions overall? And so yeah, we're at COP28, we may not see a lot of specific things come out of this that we would hope for, but after 28 of these, we've gotten pretty good at advancing the agenda a little bit each time. And so part of what happens in these spaces is that we make those official steps to make things happen over the longer period. But in addition to these official meetings, like the ones here in the Blue Zone this year, there are two other elements of COPs that I also want to tell you about. The second part of a typical COP comes when we start to move away from the government sections of the meeting and away from the kind of the high-level negotiations. Right now I'm standing in the green zone in Dubai as part of the Expo City Dubai COP28. And what we see in these green zones, that's the name they're using this year, it changes a little from year to year, but it's the notion that aside from the government sessions, we're going to have opportunities for thousands of other people to get involved in these climate-related discussions. So this is where academia, where business, where industry associations, and some nonprofits come together to talk about big environmental issues. Now this is also where COP kind of picks up some of the accusations around things like greenwashing. Because part of what's happening here is lots of businesses, lots of key players around the world are trying to suggest that they're doing all kinds of amazing and wonderful environmental initiatives. And to a certain extent, that's true. There are some really interesting things happening, and this is a place for those businesses, for those players to kind of showcase what's going on. But the real purpose here is not so much what's happening in the showrooms and the individual pavilions. Those are dedicated to big concepts like knowledge and education and innovation and technology. But part of what happens is it allows leaders in these spaces to kind of come together and chat face to face, person to person around some of the big issues that they're struggling with and wrestling with as they try to kind of resolve environmental challenges within the context of industry or within the context of specific geographies or locations. And so the value of these meetings is that people who would not otherwise connect, who would not otherwise get the opportunity to come together, can be there to exchange information and ideas. So yes, it happens in the midst of a bit of greenwashing sometimes, but the reality is that a lot of what's happening here is the creation of networks and linkages that will enable these players in business, in industry, in academia, and elsewhere to generate and develop more powerful partnerships to advance the climate agenda. And so we won't see the results out of this sort of green zone discussion immediately. It's not something where a document gets issued at the end describing the outcomes, or where people kind of announce the major things that they've accomplished. But there's this reality that part of what is happening is that they're planting the seeds that will germinate over the course of the next 2, 3, 4, 5 years as these companies and other players begin to work together to achieve environmental goals.
The third piece of the COP structure is really the things that happen off-site. So with 100,000 delegates in things like the blue zone and the green zone, sometimes it's good to get away from all of that into other zones or parallel and side events that have been set up by organizations from all around the world. Right now I'm in the innovation zone, the climate action innovation zone, which has actually been a feature of COPs since 2016. And the goal of these side events is to bring together a smaller number of people in more creative spaces so that they can really dive more deeply into some of the key challenges without having to deal with the hullabaloo of the larger structure. So the first 2 days of this particular event are focused on technology and innovation, followed by side events on finance, on hydrogen, on agri-food systems, and this notion that we can bring together a group of specialists in a quieter, safer space to have those kinds of discussions. I'm here, in fact, as a speaker with an organization out of the UK called Island Innovation, which is focused exclusively on the issues and challenges faced by coastal communities, small island states, and island regions in the face of climate change. And that's the kind of side event that allows people to kind of get together to discuss an issue in much more depth than just in the kind of the larger processes over in the blue zone and the green zone. And what this allows through these side events is more concrete, more specific, more focused, more tailored action to actually try to achieve some of the things that we're talking about in the larger meetings.